Coming up in today's newscast, PA President Abbas heads to New York to take up his new position as head of the G77 bloc at the UN. Egypt and Israel reportedly coordinate in the Sinai Peninsula against ISIS, and a very unlikely participant makes history at the Tiberias Marathon. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas on Friday said that he intends to re-examine all agreements with Israel, including the Oslo peace accords and security coordinations. Abbas also said that he does not intend to negotiate on the expected United States peace plan because of President Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Abbas told a group of reporters, quote, "We are dealing with three issues that we cannot accept: the situation with the U.S., the situation with Israel, and the situation with Hamas." Well, regarding the U.S., he said the doors to the U.S. are closed to the Palestinian people, adding that until it takes back its decision against the Palestinian people, no Palestinian is to meet with the American leadership, no matter what their role is. Abbas then continued to say that the future is dangerous, and he has no more strength to fight, but will not end his life as a traitor. Quote, "I can say no, and I have Palestinian people beside me that can say no." Additionally, Abbas was in Egypt to meet with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to discuss the failed reconciliation between his Fatah group and terror group Hamas in Gaza. Egypt has been acting as a mediator between the two factions, but the two have been rivals since 2007 when Hamas ousted Abbas's Fatah from the Strip. Finally, in Egypt, Abbas also said that he was now ready to travel to New York City in the near future to assume the chairmanship of the Group of 77, or G77, at the UN. A coalition of 134 developing nations that often work in tandem and represent nearly 80% of the Earth's population. Both the United States and Israel have expressed their deep opposition to the appointment, however, which will grant the Palestinians more rights at the United Nations. Moving now to Gaza, the Hamas terror group has just arrested 5 men that are suspected to have trashed the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority's television station in the Gaza Strip over the weekend. On Friday, armed men stormed the offices of the Palestinian Broadcasting Corporation in Gaza City, demanding the entire main studio, cameras and filming equipment included. The Palestinian Authority General Supervisor for Official Media immediately accused Hamas of full responsibility for the break-in, claiming it was a direct attack against the PA's people within Gaza. Hamas, however, has now taken 5 former PA employees into custody, all of whom coincidentally had had their salaries recently suspended. Then, in a separate incident in the territory, 5 people were injured in an explosion in the southern Gaza Strip. According to local media, a massive blast took place from the home of Mohammed Talal al-Ajani, who happens to be the Rafah Brigade commander of the Popular Resistance Committees, a Gaza terror group in the region. The explosion is said to have caused a fire and major damage to neighboring buildings in Rafah, though, and this wasn't the only violence in the area over the weekend. 10,000 Palestinians set tires aflame and hurled explosive devices at the IDF on the Gaza border on Friday to take part in the latest of what has become the weekly March of Return demonstrations. The IDF responded with its typical crowd dispersal methods, and a reported 6 Palestinians were injured in the aftermath. Finally, in efforts to deter this type of terror from the outset, last week, Israeli Interior Minister Gilad Erdan announced that Israel will be lowering prison conditions for terrorists to make conditions as rigid as possible. Hamas officials claimed that his move is just the latest declaration of war against Palestinian prisoners, though, but Erdan claims that Israel must no longer capitulate to terrorists or be deterred by threats and hunger strikes as part of the country's moral duty to its victims of terror. Now, while PA President Abbas, among other things, was mulling the cancellation of security cooperations with Israel, the IDF and Shin Bet forces were hard at work over the weekend, responding to multiple threats. In a series of raids across the West Bank, over a dozen suspects of terror-related crimes were arrested. Saturday night, a Palestinian gunman opened fire on an Egged brand bus driving from Jerusalem to Beit El in the West Bank. The driver was lightly injured from glass shards, and now, as this is just another in a series of similar attacks in recent weeks, Egged drivers have announced their intent to strike. They've also demanded that if nothing else, they be allowed to change the routes towards safer areas. Chairman of the Israeli bus drivers organization, Israel Ganon, explained that many drivers are simply considering quitting outright as, quote, "our blood is not free." Well, immediately following last night's shooting, Israeli forces entered the nearby villages of Al-Bireh and seized video footage of the area. In the clashes that ensued, however, the PA Health Ministry reported a Palestinian man being injured by IDF gunfire Saturday night. He was allegedly hit in the head by a rubber bullet, suffering a skull fracture and internal bleeding. IDF forces only confirmed the raids and not the injury, though. Then later, overnight Saturday, 10 other Palestinians were arrested and taken in for questioning by the IDF and Shin Bet, suspected of involvement in terror activities. though it is unclear if these suspects are related to the bus shooting, as the IDF is still searching for suspects involved in the 3 previous shootings in the area over the past month. These attacks include the shootings at the Givat Asaf and Ofra junctions. Speaking of which, 17-year-old Mohammed Barghouti from the West Bank village of Khobar near Ramallah was detained on Friday by the IDF, suspected of being involved in the 2 shootings with his 2 brothers, Asim and Salih. Salih, suspected of the Ofra shooting, was killed in a shootout with the IDF on December 12th. Asim, who shot up Givat Asaf the next day, killing 2 soldiers, is still on the run. According to a CBS interview with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Israel and Egypt are cooperating on security in the Sinai against the scourge of Islamic State or ISIS militants. The full interview will air Sunday on 60 Minutes, but perhaps hinting that Egyptians aren't yet ready for this aforementioned partnership, Egyptian government officials have also requested that the interview not be aired. After all having fought 4 wars with Israel in the past, the growing ties with Israel have already been cause for division within the Egyptian parliament. Still, it's not clear that it was this revelation that caused Egypt to request the cancellation of the airing. Egypt and Israel have gotten a lot closer over the years, with Sisi and Prime Minister Netanyahu even having met at least twice, and at any rate, the joint defense of the Sinai wouldn't be too surprising. Egyptian forces are still struggling to rid their country of the extremist group, with 2 bombs being found just this weekend near a Coptic church in Cairo. Islamic State insurgents regularly target Coptic Christians, tourists, and Egyptian security forces. And in this incident, 2 bombs were found inside a bag on a rooftop near the church. During attempts to defuse them, one of them went off and an Egyptian police officer was killed. 2 more officers, including the commander of the bomb squad, were also injured by the blast. Joining us now with more on Israeli-Egyptian cooperation is Dr. Martin Sherman, the founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Sherman, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so first of all, what do you make of these latest reports coming from CBS and the fact that Egyptian officials want to squash it? Why do you think the reasoning for that is?
Well, I'm not sure that it's got so much to do with the cooperation of Israel. Of course, that may be a factor, but there were some rather awkward questions they asked about political prisoners in Egypt. And I think that also may be a reason that the Egyptians feel embarrassed about having this aired. So I'm not sure it's only the Israeli aspect, if it is the Israeli aspect at all.
Okay, well, so let's take it down that route before we kind of go back to some of my other questions. Assuming that it is about the political prisoners, according to the excerpts that were released so far, at least, Sisi didn't seem to say anything incriminating. In fact, he denied that they had any sort of political prisoners. So what's the issue?
The question
exactly?
is how convincing would that sound to an international audience?
Well, that's a different matter.
But I understood that was what embarrassed him more than his forthright admission of cooperating with Israel. But who knows?
Okay.
But I think in many ways, Sisi is potentially one of the most important world leaders today. And I think his role is being underrated by people in the West. And in many ways, the way he was treated by the Obama regime sort of exposes their underlying agenda.
Well, why? Okay, can you expand on that? Why do you think Sisi is one of the most important figures today?
Well, I think he's one of the few figures in the Muslim world who's prepared to really take on the fundamentalists, and he's talked openly about reforming Islam, which I think fits in well with his willingness to cooperate with Israel. I don't think we should be complacent about it because I don't know how firmly entrenched he is in his position. But I think there are at least 2 dangers. I don't know how firmly he is entrenched in power.
Okay.
Because the Muslim Brotherhood is down and not out.
Okay.
And there are a lot of domestic difficulties in Egypt which could unseat him. The other thing is the elephant in the room is Ethiopia, and I think this is something that people don't give enough weight to. Ethiopia is building a massive dam on the Blue Nile, which is liable to seriously constrict the flow of water into Egypt, and Egypt's going to have to find some way to contend with that. And I don't know how much resources and resolve they're going to have for imposing law and order in Sinai. And this is something that's going to be, in my opinion, a serious consideration for Israel, because once the Ethiopians complete the dam, and even if they don't use it for irrigation, but just the losses due to evaporation, could cause a serious problem in Israel, in Egypt. Sorry. And I think then paradoxically, one of the areas of cooperation with Egypt then could be with Israel with desalination and water conservation, etc., etc. But I think Sinai could turn into a massive problem for Israel.
Okay, so then let's go back now a moment to the alleged Israeli, Egyptian cooperations, which here in Israel it doesn't sound terribly, surprising that Israel would help, at least with their air force, in attacking ISIS in the Sinai. So would that be, assuming that might have been an issue for the Egyptian government with this latest interview, assuming that that's the case, do Egyptians on the ground still have animosity towards Israelis like they did, 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I'm sure that there's a lot of public animosity towards Israel and across the Muslim world. But I think the danger in Sinai is because to deal with ISIS, and I'm not sure that the man in the street in Egypt would worry about us dealing with ISIS if it didn't mean infringing on Egyptian sovereignty in Sinai. But I think the problem is that for Egypt to deal with ISIS, it needs armaments over and above the demilitarization agreement with Israel. And so Israel is agreeing to erode the demilitarization agreement and allowing armaments in it that exceed it. Now, this is all very well if Sisi stays in power, but if Sisi loses power and all those armaments either fall to a hostile Egyptian regime or fall into the hands of the jihadis because the Egyptians may not have the resolve or the will to fight them, I think we've been in a very difficult situation. And that's why I'm very worried about what's happening in Sinai, because it is Israel's longest southern border. And if that falls into hostile hands, we're going to have a serious problem.
All right. Well, Dr. Sherman, thank you so much for coming in. And yeah, we're definitely going to have to keep an eye out for these developments as they occur. And we'll have you back in when they do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
In other security-related news, United States National Security Advisor John Bolton began his visit to Israel and Turkey this week in efforts to calm American allies' fears following the announcement of the pending American troop withdrawal from Syria. And fears have been especially high lately, considering that just last week, President Trump said Iran can do whatever it wants in Syria after the United States leaves. Not helping the cause, Bolton failed to arrive with any sort of timetable for the withdrawal plan. But speaking to reporters ahead of landing in Tel Aviv, Bolton reiterated a few key things. First, that the lack of American presence in Syria should not be interpreted by Syria as an excuse to resume the use of chemical weapons. He said any violation of this red line would result in a very heavy response. United States officials also mentioned that Bolton will likely explain how some American troops will simply fall back to Iraq rather than leaving the region entirely. Next, Bolton added that the United States will remain, quote, very supportive of Israeli airstrikes in Syria against Iranian advancements towards the northern Israeli border. This, a day after Prime Minister Netanyahu reportedly spoke via telephone with Russian President Vladimir Putin, where the two were said to have discussed the same thing, continued military coordination in Syria against Iranian encroachment. Finally, though, Israel's worries in the region aren't the only ones. Bolton is scheduled to continue on to Turkey tomorrow to meet with Turkish President Erdogan, where they'll talk about how they intend to continue fighting the Islamic State. Whether they will discuss protections for Kurdish YPG forces, however, remains unclear. Erdogan considers the YPG a terror group, despite the Kurds fighting alongside the United States against ISIS all these years. Controversial Arab-Israeli lawmaker Hanin Zoabi announced this weekend that she will not be running for re-election in the upcoming elections. In a parting statement, Zoabi, who is from the Balad Party, one of 4 parties that make up the Joint Arab List, explained that, quote, there were those who appreciated and supported my actions and what I represented, and there were many more who hated and fought me and my opinions. And it's true. Politicians from across the political spectrum expressed their joy over her departure. Zoabi has long been one of the most controversial members of Knesset, having, for example, joined the 2010 Gaza flotilla and justified Hamas terrorist actions. Meanwhile, a new Arab party has just registered to participate in the upcoming elections, called New Horizon, which says it's an Arab centrist party that seeks to improve relations between Arabs and Israelis. In related news, all eyes are now on former Likud defense minister and IDF chief of staff Moshe Ya'alon, whose new party Telem is reportedly being courted by parties on the left. He's supposedly in talks with former IDF chief of staff Benny Gantz, as well as Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid, while Labour Party leader Avi Gabay, who is plummeting in the polls, has urged all parties to unite under his leadership. Then, according to a Chadashot news report on the right, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is considering removing Education Minister Naftali Bennett and Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked from their ministerial positions ahead of the elections. This after Jewish Home Party members of the Knesset asked Netanyahu to remove the duo from their posts because the portfolios belong to the Jewish Home Party. And last week, Bennett and Shaked announced their split from the Jewish Home to form Hayamin HaChadash, or the New Right Party. Netanyahu hasn't announced a decision on the matter, but is reportedly considering it. His only concern, supposedly, though, is that firing Bennett and Shaked at this time might make them political martyrs. Speaking of the elections, Prime Minister Netanyahu is again campaigning less for votes in the April elections and more for preventing Attorney General Mandelblit from issuing indictment recommendations before the vote. In a video released on Saturday, the Israeli premier used an allegory to explain how it would be ridiculous to start a trial before elections unless there were also enough time to finish it.
תשמעו קטע. אדם הולך ברחוב במדינה מזרח תיכונית מסוימת, כתף תפורה, פרוטזה מדלדלת. שואלים אותו, מה קרה? הוא אומר, הורשעתי בערכאה ראשונה בגניבה. ומה קרה אחר כך? זוכיתי בערעור. מישהו יכול להחזיר לו את היד? מישהו יכול להחזיר לכם את הבחירות? לא מתחילים בשימוע לפני הבחירות, אם לא מסיימים את השימוע עד הבחירות. שתפו.
Most Israelis disagree with Netanyahu, however, as a new poll released on Saturday by Chadashot TV News shows that nearly two-thirds of Israelis want AG Mandelblit to publish his findings before the elections. And Yesh Atid party leader Yair Lapid responded to Netanyahu's video in kind, saying, quote, "The Prime Minister thinks we're in Saudi Arabia. Can someone give back our sanity? If someone is indicted, they can't run in the elections anyhow," end quote. Only 22% of respondents to the weekend poll agreed with the Prime Minister, who for weeks now has been arguing that it's inconceivable to start the hearing process at this time and how it would be an absurd, terrible blow to democracy. Meanwhile, 14% of respondents were undecided. After over a week of speculation, a gag order was lifted today, revealing that the 5 Jewish miners arrested by Israeli security forces recently are all suspects in the murder of Palestinian woman Aisha Ravi, who was stoned to death while driving her car on October 12th. Ravi was driving along with her husband beside her and was injured when the stones struck her in the head. And the Shin Bet said that the 5 Jewish miners are also suspected of other Jewish terror offenses. Additionally, it was also revealed that the miners are all students at the Pri Haaretz Yeshiva in Richelim. Security forces this past week arrested 3 of the teens, who were detained and only allowed access to a lawyer after a week. In response, on Saturday night, hundreds of protesters demonstrated outside the Prime Minister's residence under the banner, quote, "Settlers also have basic rights," end quote. But under Israeli law, authorities can delay access to an attorney for terrorism suspects. Then, 2 additional miners were arrested over the weekend, leading religious Zionist Rabbi Chaim Druckman to publish a video calling on the Prime Minister to release the suspects, saying that they are not terrorists, though these latest allegations suggest otherwise. Moving on, it seems that new immigrants aren't the only ones being discriminated against by some in the ultra-Orthodox community. New reports have just come out alleging that ultra-Orthodox children of Ethiopian and Sephardic descent were both being rejected from the Talmud Torah schools in Jerusalem on the grounds that their skin color might cause, quote, "trauma for their classmates," end quote. In fact, parents of the rejected students complained that they were given many poor excuses from the school, including that they just weren't, quote, "the school's style." And speaking to Ynet, the school also mentioned that in relation to rejecting an Ethiopian student, quote, "other children are experiencing difficulties in dealing with the black child." Well, the Talmud Torah schools in Jerusalem are religious Orthodox institutions for kindergarten and elementary-age students, and what's worse, their budgets are largely funded through public monies annually granted by the state. Well, an investigation was opened after the allegations were made public, and at the end, it's possible that the schools will lose all funding and will be shuttered, with Education Minister Naftali Bennett saying that, quote, "any school that refuses to accept a student due to his origin will be closed. Racism is an ugly phenomenon which we must root out of Israeli society. All Israel students from all sectors and backgrounds are our children," end quote. And we at ILTV agree. If Black, Middle Eastern, or any other race of students cause difficulties for the other children just because of their origins, chances are the parents and administrators at such an institution are doing something horrendously and revoltingly wrong. Now, this is interesting. At least 2 more women's marches have been canceled in the United States following accusations of anti-Semitism. Top leaders of the organization are still under fire for refusing to cut ties with the Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan and refusing to heed the concerns of thousands of the march's Jewish backers. So now, it looks like New Orleans is the latest city that is being affected by the controversy, a big letdown for the southern city that has held women's marches for the last 2 years. Then on Friday, the march in the town of Eureka in Northern California was also canceled over concerns that the participants would be, quote, "overwhelmingly white and lacking representation from several perspectives in the community." Chicago is also canceled, but is citing concerns of high costs and overextended volunteers rather than allegations of anti-Semitism. But this all comes after one of the co-founders of the Women's March movement, Tamika Mallory, told the New York Times that white Jews are among those who, quote, uphold white supremacy, while of course being oppressed by it. In fact, Mallory has been in the center of many claims that the movement's leaders have engaged in anti-Semitism and or failed to condemn it. Brooklyn-based activist Vanessa Rubel is one of the handful of women who initiated the Women's March in Washington in January of 2017, which happens to be one of the biggest demonstrations in American history. And she, too, says that she felt marginalized and eventually pushed out of the movement for her Jewish heritage, especially when the movement's two leaders put out a set of unity principles for marchers that excluded Jewish participants. And Warble clearly isn't the only one who felt left out either. Back in November, Women's March co-founder Teresa Shook called on the movement's co-chairs to resign, claiming they allow anti-Semitism. And last month, the Washington State March was canceled for the same reason. As more and more marches are being shut down, we'll have to wait and see what happens with the biggest of them all, the Washington, D.C. March. A Women's March tweet has already assured supporters, though, that it's still on, even given the current government shutdown.
Responding to last week's allegations of capitulating to BDS pressures, the UK-based HSBC banking group has now recently come out against those reports. Initially, it was said that HSBC decided to divest from Israel's Elbit systems due to multiple ongoing efforts and petitions from the BDS organizations. HSBC now says, however, that they did no such thing. Speaking to the Jerusalem Post, HSBC official Stuart Levy explained last week that their decision to divest from Elbit Systems was not a result of BDS campaigning, nor is it indicative of support for the BDS movement's objectives. Rather, it was based on HSBC's, quote, long-standing defense policy whereby we do not invest in companies linked to the production or manufacturing of cluster munitions, end quote. Levy then continued to tell the Post that some major American defense contractors are also affected by this policy. And as proof that it's nothing more, Levy pointed to the fact that HSBC has a banking operation in Tel Aviv, provides banking services to many Israeli companies, and has every intention of continuing to do so. Initial reports alleging HSBC's capitulation came in late December when the UK-Palestine Solidarity Campaign reported the so-called success of their year-long efforts, monthly demonstrations, and signed petition. Well, HSBC never confirmed this report and indeed is now denying it. As for cluster munitions in Israel, though, it has been confirmed that while Israel hasn't used them in over a decade, the Jewish state does continue to manufacture and sell them. Okay, so here's another great story to start the week. 29-year-old ultra-Orthodox lecturer and mother of 5, Bracha Deutsch, made history Friday when she came in first place at the Tiberias Marathon, completing the 42-kilometer or 26-mile race in just 2 hours and 42 minutes.
Roughly 1,000 runners participate in the Tiberias Marathon competition every year, which traverses the northern Sea of Galilee area. And in the men's category, Aimro Alamia won with a time of 2 hours and 15 minutes. But Deutsch, who made Aliyah or immigrated to Israel 8 years ago from New Jersey and only started running 3 years ago, is still the biggest headline from the race. Speedy Beatty, as she's become known, is the first known female Haredi athlete, and she first made waves when she took first place at the National Half Marathon last month as well, with a running time of 1 hour and 19 minutes. Now, while most Haredi women are either in the workplace or raising a family, far away from sports, Deutsch explains that her husband Michael, a yeshiva teacher and computer science student, was the one to stay home with the kids while she raced. And when asked about the contradiction between religion and sport, she replies that she doesn't see one. Quote, taking care of both body and soul is considered a mitzvah, or a good deed. In the Haredi world, when you deviate from the norm, there will always be criticism, but I knew I was doing something right, end quote. She added that for her, running was a spiritual act, explaining that some people go to the woods to talk to God, I do it on a run.
And now for our Hebrew word of the day. This weekend, the Tiberias Marathon gathered hundreds of people in the northern Sea of Galilee just to run. And that's why today's word is larutz, or to run. Now, if you've ever visited Israel, you've probably seen many loads of people that run or ratzim alongside the promenade in Tel Aviv or in Haifa. And it makes sense, right? Because there's no better view than the ocean to run or larutz with. But when it comes to me, I'm not what you would call a ben adam sheratz, or a person who runs by the pretty views. Personally, I prefer to walk slowly and or to sit and paint the view. So if you ever see me ratz or running, you should rutz or run too, because something or someone is probably chasing me. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be cold and rainy with a low of around 49 or 9 degrees Celsius. And then tomorrow will be cloudy, but with a slight rise in temperatures to a high of 61 or about 16 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.71 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Israel English News and on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you very much for watching.